All right, guys. Hey, welcome to the back shop. We're here behind the sales scenes at the J.C. Lewis Ford Statesboro location in the shop where we lift everything. This is the all-new Bronco. This is our mannequin unit. What that means is we have the unit for 4 months. We can loan it out to customers that may have service issues, but most of all, we got to dress it up like a mannequin. We've got tons of accessories coming in, but the first thing we wanted to start with was the level. And so this particular unit here already comes from the factory leveled. So trucks typically have a rake in the front, a drop. We put a 2-inch spacer on the front above the strut housing that lifts that front up to match the back so that you can fit a larger set of tires. With the Bronco, it already comes level. So when you order the kit, you put the 2-inch spacer on all 4 strut houses. And so basically drop it all down, put the spacers, it lifts the vehicle, and it allows us to run 35s, great clearance, and we do not sacrifice any of the ride quality because we're not changing out any parts. And that's really the difference between a level kit and a lift. We're not changing out any of the suspension parts, the control arms, any of the struts, the shocks. This is all factory except for we've just created a 2-inch spacer above the struts. Andrew, one of our certified technicians here, he's gonna change out each one of the struts. Right above it, he's gonna put this spacer.
And we start by removing the wheels and tires. And then the next step would be to remove the nuts off of the top of the strut. And then our next step is to remove the nut off of the tie rod end link.
It looks like it's waiting on
and then sometimes you may have to take a hammer and give the steering knuckle a little bit of a whack with the hammer, give you a little bit of room to pull the tie rod end out. And then our next step after that was to remove the lower nuts on the struts. And here we are removing only the lower nut on the stabilizer link. We did not have to remove the stabilizer link fully. We did not have to take the nut off the top. And we're removing the nut off of the upper control arm, and I like to use a short length pry bar to help hold the control arm down as I am tapping on the knuckle, so that way when it lets go, it doesn't just go shooting up. There is a little bit of a pressure built in behind it. I also removed the bolts holding the brake lines and the ABS sensor. I do it because I don't like stretching the lines and possibly causing an issue with a stretched brake line or ABS sensor becoming torn. We removed the axle nut to free the axle from the spindle. That way we could get a little more leverage on the lower control arm to pull the strut out. I'm using I believe it was a 36-inch pry bar right here. I'm just trying to free the lower portion of the strut from the lower control arm. Sometimes you have to put pressure towards the middle, sometimes off towards the side, just so you can maneuver it out. I actually put one nut back on the top portion of the strut right here. That way, whenever I do free it, the strut doesn't come crashing down. I won't have to try to catch it before it hits the floor. I'm still right here, still trying to maneuver the lower portion of the strut out of the lower control arm. I finally got the axle to come free from the spindle right there, which should free up a little bit more room. And then I got one side out right here. And then you just gotta take, most of the time take your pry bar and go to the side that's not out yet. Give it a little bit of a push, and it'll free up. On the left side of the spindle there, you can see how tight the brake lines can get, how they almost stretch. And that's the main reason why I take the nut off of the bracket there. And then these lower control arms are different than what you'll find on a F-150 or even a Ranger. Once you get the lower studs out of the lower control arm there, like you see, it does like to get stuck in that little triangular shape. So you will have to pry the lower control arm down even more to get it up out of there. I actually grabbed a little bit longer of a pry bar here for this. Sometimes you have to find wherever you can to get some leverage to actually move the lower control arm. There we finally got the strut all the way out. So, and then this is the one of the spacers that we installed. You do have to install your own studs. It comes with all the studs and the hardware to pull the studs through the spacer. You maneuver the stud through the holes there, and then you put the bigger nut on first. It will not thread. And then you put the threaded nut on, and then you will take your 17 millimeter socket, and then you will tighten it down until you see it become flush on the back side. Just like that. And then you just have to remove the nuts and do that for every single hole you have there. If you're doing just fronts, there will be 6 studs. And then if you're doing front and rear, there will be 12. You see me actually twisting them through. Sometimes the holes are pretty tight. They won't just slide right through. So you'll have to take a pair of pliers and feed it through, and then twist it from the back side. And then I removed the pin from the top portion of the strut. It has to be removed or else the spacers will not fit. Then we use the 3 nuts that we took off of the strut when it was on the vehicle to install the spacer to the strut. And then we have new nuts supplied with the kit that we tighten when we put the strut back on the vehicle. I tried using a socket to tighten the nuts down, to tighten the spacer to the strut, but it was really tight, so I had to actually grab a wrench, and we had to tighten it down that way instead. So I find out which way these struts mount in, and then I actually spin it around, and you'll see me here. I will put these studs in the holes and pull towards me. That way when I spin it back around and put the strut in, the studs are actually facing towards the inside of the vehicle, which makes it a little bit easier when you're reinstalling the strut. And then just like when you're removing, when you're reinstalling, you have to put a little bit of pressure on the lower control arm to maneuver it down a little bit. That way you can get the strut to fit back in place. And you got to make sure the studs are sitting in the correct holes. Now I am installing the new nuts on top of these struts. I'm just putting them just finger tight, just enough to hold it up there. That way it don't move and it stays in place. And now that the strut is sitting right where I wanted it to be, I went ahead and tightened down the top nuts. My next step here was to get the axle back into the spindle and to get the axle nut reinstalled. It wasn't wanting to tighten right there. There was a little piece of debris or trash in the thread, so I just had to knock it out. That way it would thread on correctly. And I reinstalled the tie rod end. And then I am reinstalling the lower strut nuts. Everything so far is just hand tight, just to make sure everything's right where I want it to be. And then I go ahead and tighten down the lower strut nuts. And then I tighten down the outer tie rod end. And I actually still felt a little piece of debris on the threads there, so I took it back off, re-inspected it, cleaned it again, and then I will reinstall it once more. So now I'm going to maneuver the upper control arm down into the knuckle. It can be a little bit tricky. Sometimes it's best to use 2 pry bars. About a 36-inch one I think I have here, and then the little one I think is maybe about 20 inches or so. You don't have to move a whole lot. As you can see, it wasn't that difficult to get this one to move down enough, but sometimes they can be a bit tricky. Then I fully tighten the axle nut here. Then I inspect it on the back side to make sure it's actually sitting flush right where I want it to be. I just just removed the pin off of the strut for the other side. It's going to be the same on both sides of the front. Again, right here I am putting pressure on the lower control arm to maneuver the strut back into position. Sometimes it is helpful to have a lending hand to help you out. An extra set of eyes could be helpful because they may spot out that you don't have the axle fully disengaged from the knuckle like I did not here. But luckily, he was there to help me out. Sometimes one side can be pretty easy to maneuver back in, and then you'll think it'll be the same for the other side, but sometimes that is not the case. Again, I put the top strut nuts on just hand tight so it'll hold it up in place without falling down. I went ahead and installed the nuts on the lower strut and tightened them down. I use the 2 pry bar method again here, just like on the other side. It's easier to get the shorter pry bar in at first, but most time you can't get enough leverage to move the upper control arm down enough, so then you have to grab the longer pry bar to help you out with that. Now that I have the lower portion of the strut tightened and I have the upper control arm in position, I go ahead and tighten the upper strut nut. Here I am installing the axle nut. Again, being sure to check behind to make sure that the axle is sitting flush and right where I need it to be. And then install the brake line and ABS bracket. So right here we are maneuvering the sway bar. That way we can get the sway bar end links back into position. sometimes it can be a little difficult to get both sides to go right where you want them at the same time. So again, I have someone close by to help me out. On the rear, we start off by removing the upper strut nuts, just like on the front. But you will have to remove the wheel well liner. I tried removing the top nuts without removing the liner, and it gets in the way. It'll scrape up against your hand. Not a good feeling, so I would suggest go ahead and removing it like I did. There's not quite as many nuts and bolts to remove on the rear. As you'll see here, I remove one nut and bolt for the track bar, and then there is one more nut and bolt towards the bottom end of the strut. So those two, plus the upper strut nut. This here is the nut and bolt for the lower portion of the rear strut. I was attempting to remove the upper strut nuts with the wheel well liner still on the vehicle, and then I realized it would be a lot easier if I were to just remove it to get it out of the way. To remove the wheel well liner, there is a couple of push pins that you have to remove. The centermost part of them will actually twist out, and then you can pull the whole pin itself all the way out. The push pins can get a little bit tricky sometimes, but it helps to have a smaller Phillips head screwdriver and a clip tool with you while removing. Once I get a few of these push pins out, you will see that I can maneuver the wheel well liner enough to be out of my way of removing the nuts. Now that the liner is out of the way, there is plenty of room to get a wrench and remove the nuts. Now that everything was nice and loose, I could remove the rear strut. The rear spacers were installed just like the spacers that we installed on the front. I maneuvered the rear strut into position, and then I take the nuts for the top of the strut and go ahead and put them hand tight just like I did up front. That way it will hold and it will not fall down as I maneuver the bottom portion into position. So right here I was using a pry bar to line up the track bar, that way we can get the bolt to slide all the way through. So again, I'm trying to maneuver the track bar, that way I can get the bolt to slide through. I decided to move over to the other side and release all the nuts and bolts. That way the rear end would have a little bit more movement, so I could line up the track bar holes on the other side. once I had the top strut nuts, the lower strut nut end bolt, and the track bar nut end bolt removed, I went ahead and took out the strut on the driver's rear side. And then just like all the other ones, I positioned the strut into place and then just hand tighten the top nuts. That way it will stay put. I have a buddy helping me right here. I'm actually pushing down on the axle. That way he can get the lower strut bolt to slide through the hole. And then the same thing with the track bar here. I am actually pushing the axle towards the rear of the vehicle. That way the bolt hole will line up. Then it's the same on the other side. Here I'm pushing the axle towards the rear of the vehicle while my helping hand is lining up the bolt holes for the track bar. Then once we have everything lined up, we go ahead and tighten everything down. We reinstall the wheel well liner. Then we installed 35, 12.5, 18 BF Goodrich KO2s on the stock wheels. And then right here we're mounting them on the vehicle. All right, so now we have our new Bronco sitting a little bit higher, bigger, more aggressive tire. I like the way the Bronco looks from the factory, but you can't ever go wrong with lifting it up a little bit, putting a little more aggressive tire. Now you can take your Bronco out in the mud, go on trails, use it for whatever you want to use it for. The rough country lift, it's a pretty easy lift to install. Some parts can get a little difficult. It's always best to have somebody there with you to help out. But overall, it's not too hard of an install, really. You and a buddy could easily get it done within a day. Other than that, I love the way this new Bronco looks, especially with the tires. Can't wait to go take it out in the mud and see what all it can do.
The 35s look wonderful on it. We're going to test it out today in the field, see how it rides. But man, we couldn't be more happy with the Bronco. Everybody's loving it. The ride quality is tremendous. It feels great, it's confident, it handles well. So we're really excited to see how it drives with the level on it.